Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the incredibly rich global history of one of the most famous stories ever told, Cinderella. We're going to trace her iconic footwear all the way through time. Now, most of us grew up with a very specific, polished image of Cinderella, right? Usually it's heavily influenced by a modern animation and one particular French author. But the true story of this persecuted heroine and her famous shoes actually spans thousands of years. It crosses continents, and it features a completely fascinating historical debate about translation, magic, and culture. So let's just kick things off with the ultimate mystery that we're going to unravel by the end of this explainer. Was that iconic slipper always made of glass? For over a century, there's been this really persistent rumor floating around that the original French storyteller simply made a mistake, confusing the word for glass with the word for a luxurious medieval fur. Well, we're going to look at the hard evidence to see if Cinderella was actually meant to be wearing soft squirrel fur instead of rigid, fragile glass. But, before we solve that mystery, we really need to understand where this story actually comes from in the first place. To understand just how universal this narrative is, we have to look at how folklorists classify it. They call it ATU 510A, or the persecuted heroine tale type. And the core DNA of a Cinderella story is surprisingly specific. It basically always involves a young woman who is mistreated by her stepfamily and forced to live in the ashes. Then she receives beautiful clothing from some sort of supernatural helper so she can attend a ball or a festival in secret. She loses a shoe, and finally, the prince will only marry the woman whom that specific shoe fits. It's a beautifully simple framework, but as we'll see, different cultures around the world dress this exact framework in incredibly diverse ways. Just look at this timeline. It brilliantly illustrates the massive chronological and geographical leaps the story took. It proves this is a universal human narrative, definitely not just a single European invention. We start all the way back in the 6th century BC with the legend of Rhodopis in Egypt and ancient Greece. Then we take a massive jump across the world to Tang Dynasty China in 850 AD. And honestly, it isn't until the 1600s that the story makes its famous print debuts in Europe, starting with Giambattista Basile in Italy, followed by Charles Perrault in France, and eventually the Brothers Grimm in Germany well into the 19th century. Section 1. Ancient Echoes. Rhodopis. Okay, we have to be really careful here to peel back the layers of history and separate fact from modern fiction. The actual ancient account, recorded by the historian Strabo in the late 1st century BC, tells the story of a Greek courtesan named Rhodopis. While she's bathing, an eagle swoops down, steals her sandal, and carries it all the way to Memphis, dropping it literally right into the lap of the pharaoh. He's so amazed by the neatness of the sandal and the sort of divine action of the bird that he searches for her and marries her. Now, if you look online today, you'll often find a modernized Egyptian Cinderella that throws in evil stepsisters, magic, and a grand festival. But actually, scratch that. That version is just a modern fabrication tracing back to an author named Olive Beaupre Miller in the 1920s. The true ancient tale is much simpler, but it already nails that crucial shoe test motif. Section 2. The Golden Slipper. Ye Xian. Traveling along the Silk Road all the way to Tang Dynasty China around 850 AD, we meet Ye Xian. She's a beautiful, kind girl who befriends this magical fish. Unfortunately, her jealous stepmother tricks the fish, kills it, and serves it up for dinner. Devastated, Ye Xian is visited by an ancestor spirit who tells her to bury the fish bones because these bones actually have magical, wish-granting powers. When her stepmother forbids her from attending the New Year festival, she asks the bones for help, and they grant her this stunning sea green silk gown and a pair of tiny, shiny golden slippers. She ends up losing one while fleeing the festival, and the local king uses it to track her down. It's crazy to think this story was written over 800 years before the French version, yet it hits almost every single narrative beat of the Cinderella we know today. Section 3. Europe's Fairy Tale Masters. Now here's a wild fact. There is absolutely no single original version of Cinderella in Europe. Giambattista Basile published The Cat Cinderella in Italy back in 1634, and that's the first known European appearance in print. Charles Perrault followed up in 1697 with Cendrillon, and that's the version that gave us all the iconic stuff like the fairy godmother and the pumpkin carriage. Over a century later, in 1812, the Brothers Grimm published their famous German version, but they are all just adaptations of oral folk tales that had already been circulating around the fire for generations. Before we get to the whole glass slipper thing, it is absolutely fascinating to note just how much darker the German version is. It really forces us to question where our pristine, Disney-fied image of the fairy tale comes from. In the Brothers Grimm tale Aschenputtel, Cinderella doesn't just go to one ball, she goes to a festival 3 times. Her slippers evolve from silk embroidered with silver all the way to solid gold. But the most shocking part?
When the prince comes around with a shoe, the stepmother actually hands her daughters a knife. One cuts off her toe, and the other literally slices off her heel just to force their feet into the solid gold shoe. They only get caught because magical birds point out the blood dripping from the slipper. So yeah, it's a far cry from the gentle magic we're used to.
Section 4. The slipper debate. Glass or fur? All right, this brings us to the climactic mystery of our explainer. The famous French writer Honoré de Balzac sparked a really persistent legend suggesting that the most iconic shoe in history was nothing more than a giant misunderstanding. In the 1830s, Balzac popularized this idea that Charles Perrault simply made a transcription error when he was listening to some peasant telling the story by the fire. He claimed it was an auditory mistake that entirely changed the course of fairy tale history.
See, Balzac noticed this crazy linguistic coincidence. The French word for glass, verre, V-E-R-R-E, sounds exactly the same as vair, V-A-I-R, which is a specific type of medieval squirrel fur, sometimes known as miniver. Because vair was this incredibly soft luxury item restricted to the aristocracy by French laws in the Middle Ages, Balzac and a bunch of critics after him argued that it made perfect, logical sense for a prince's bride to wear fur. I mean, they argued that dancing in a rigid, fragile glass shoe was completely absurd and impossible, so it absolutely must have been fur. This theory was so convincing it even made its way into encyclopedias.
But let's play Mythbusters for a second here, because there was no mistranslation. Folklorists today have totally debunked the fur theory. First off, Perrault explicitly wrote pantoufles de verre, glass, multiple times. He was a highly educated writer, not someone making a careless spelling error. Second, think about the magic. This is a story with mice turning into horses and pumpkins turning into carriages. Realism is clearly not the goal here. Glass is fragile, unique, and it symbolizes transformation. Finally, as researchers like Peter and Iona Opie pointed out, a soft fur slipper could easily stretch to fit those cruel stepsisters, but a rigid glass shoe, it can't be stretched. It is the ultimate, undeniable proof of a perfect fit. The fact that dancing in glass is practically impossible is exactly the point. It proves Cinderella's magical, delicate lightness. Section 5. A universal human narrative. So, having debunked the fur theory, let's step back and look at the breathtaking scope of this story. Get this. According to the American folklorist Stith Thompson, there are at least this many different documented versions of the Cinderella tale around the world. 500! 500 versions! It is a story that has resonated across practically every boundary of geography and language. And it's so cool to see how the famous footwear adapts to fit different local cultures. In ancient Egypt, we see sandals made of vegetable fiber. Over in China, they were golden. In a Venetian adaptation, the slipper is made of sparkling diamond. In the Anatolian tale of Klu Fatma from Turkey, the heroine wears a nalin, which is a traditional wooden clog. And of course, in France, we have the iconic glass slipper. Every single culture takes this foundational narrative of the persecuted heroine and weaves its own local materials, values, and traditions right into the fabric of the story. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this thought to ponder. I really encourage you to explore the rich folklore of your own heritage. The story of Cinderella isn't just a children's movie. It's this incredibly ancient, living document of human hope, resilience, and imagination. So the next time you see a glass slipper, remember the golden shoes of Ye Xian, the stolen sandal of Rhodopis, and the brilliant, intentional magic of Charles Perrault. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep exploring.